Good evening. Now, this is something you all know, and that is, in our daily interactions with other people, we are constantly trying to work out what's going on in their heads, what are they thinking and feeling. Now, we can do this in one of two ways, either intuitively, or else we can look for signs, clues in their behavior. Now, that's exactly what expert poker players do. Any poker players here? I can give you some tips afterwards. Oh, not enough. Poker players are constantly on the lookout for those giveaway signs that reveal what kinds of cards their opponents might be holding on the basis of the way that they behave. Things like how they look at their cards, how they play with their chips, and how they glance at the other players. Now, in poker, these little giveaway signs are referred to as tells. Now, the interesting thing about tells, of course, is that they aren't simply confined to poker. They exist in every walk of life. We all produce them all of the time, well, at least when we're awake. Now, they are to be found in politics, love, friendship, business, you name it, they're there, often revealing things about ourselves of which we are completely unaware and impacting on other people in ways that they do not realize. So tells include things like what we actually say, how we say it, and the way that we behave. For example, our postures, gestures, facial expressions, and patterns of gaze. For example, the way someone stands often says a lot about their state of mind. Someone who, for example, stands with their legs planted far apart is sending a very clear message. Namely, in this case, that he is immovable, both literally and figuratively. Now, as you can see, this posture uses up a lot of space. It's therefore a signal about power and dominance. And incidentally, as you can also see, it sends a very clear message in relation to the person's crotch, because it draws attention to it. And that's what guys are doing a lot of the time when they spread eagle their legs in that fashion, although they won't admit to it. Now, there are, of course, other postures. You're at a party, you're talking to somebody, you're chatting them up, in fact, and you happen to notice that they are standing with their legs crossed. Now, that is a good sign, because this is an unintentional display. It tells you, although not necessarily the person who's doing it, that that person is not going to move off very soon. In contrast, what about those cases where somebody is moving their weight from side to side, or they've got most of their weight on one foot and they're pointing the other away? That's a bad sign, because what it suggests is that they're about to move on pretty soon, particularly if the foot is pointing at the exit or at somebody else who happens to be much more attractive than you. Now, Charles Darwin, in his wonderful book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals, makes the rather important point that in our expressive displays, we often find that they are organized according to what he calls the principle of antithesis. In other words, opposite actions send opposite messages. Take, for example, the case of the Queen. Notice how she has her hands clasped in front of her. Now, this is actually one of her signature tells. It's a demure, unassuming gesture, and it also happens, incidentally, to be a self-comforting one because it allows her to hold her own hand. In contrast, we find her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, with his hands clasped behind him. Now, this too is one of his signature tells, and it's a high dominance gesture because what it tells us, in effect, is that he's so confident that he doesn't feel the need or the desire to protect himself. Now, there are other reasons why people stand with their hands in front of them. For example, they may be feeling socially or sexually insecure. Adolf Hitler, this is what his signature tell, by the way. He made a point of standing with his hands clasped rather neatly in front of his groin, prompting Germans during the war, this is, to make the remark that in the process of doing this, he was, quote unquote, concealing the last unemployed member of the Third Reich. Now, dominance is often signaled through facial expressions. People who are, particularly men who are dominant, tend to lower their eyebrows, and as this picture of Beckham shows, they also narrow their eyes, adopt a resolute set of the mouth, and reduce their smiling. Now, reduced smiling is often connected and correlated with dominance and power. So much so that psychologists have actually discovered that as people rise up through the corporate ladder, through the corporate structure, they reduce their smiling to the point where when they get to the top, they virtually eliminate it. They walk around in a kind of grump, reminding other people that how important they are. But it's interesting to observe that that process only applies in the case of men. Women, for obvious reasons, don't do this. Now, men who have large chins, quite rightly, because having a large chin in the case of a man is connected with all kinds of endocrine factors, men with large chins are deemed to be dominant. And that is part of the reason why politicians, such as Obama, spend their time raising their heads and jutting out their chin. Now, the opposite of the chin jut is the chin tuck, a gesture which you will often observe when people are feeling psychologically threatened. And the reason why we do the chin jut, we all do it, is that it protects our neck, that highly vulnerable part of the body. Now, the neck also features in another rather interesting gesture, namely what's called the head cant. People often, in order to persuade others that they are feeling submissive and coy, will lean their head over to one side. Once again, the reason for this, well, there's several reasons, but the main reason is that it enables them to show their neck, that highly vulnerable part of the body. It's rather like coming home, seeing your dog, it rolls over on its back and presents you with its tummy, the vulnerable part of its body. That's what we do. It's the same principle, and that's what women do when they cant their heads to one side. Now, it's interesting to observe that the same principle operates in relation to the way in which people smoke their cigarettes, or did. So, for example, oh, no, I've skipped something. I just wanted to make one other observation. There is what's called sexual dimorphism in relation to neck length. You all know this, and men appreciate it in women. Now, by canting her head to one side, a woman is therefore accentuating, drawing attention to the fact that she, as a woman, has a longer neck. And that makes her appear so much more attractive. And that's exactly what we find in the case of the woman who sat for this particular painting by Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. She has her head canted, and therefore, unconsciously, we find her so much more attractive. But back to smoking. It's the same principle. We find that women who smoke, in this case, she's exposing her neck, but notice also that she has exposed and presented her wrist, another highly vulnerable part of the body. Now, this, of course, is a camp gesture, as we see in this rather old photograph of Oscar Wilde. In contrast, macho men tend to smoke in a fashion that allows them to present their knuckles. And it's the same principle that informs another habit which we see widely used among politicians of gesticulating in a way that presents the back of the hands. Now, if you look at this picture, and it's pretty typical, you might say to yourself, Well, he's clearly guarding, protecting himself, defending himself, and that's why he's holding his hands in this fashion. Not at all. The reason why he's doing it is to present his knuckles, those hard, manly features of his hands. It's therefore a disguised threat signal. How very different this posture is to those postures, those gestures, where we present our palms. Here, for example, we see Desmond Tutu looking as though he's about to embrace his audience. This is the complete opposite. It's an open, conciliatory, embracing gesture. Now, tells may be informed by unconscious processes. In other words, we may produce tells that we don't even realize we are producing. Or alternatively, they may be produced deliberately. In other words, we decide that we're going to create a specific kind of impression and we consciously activate a tell. We connive, we're in that process. What I'd like to do now is to show you a few clips. The first one, they're all from a program that I presented some years ago, but the first one shows us how Bill Clinton produces deliberate tells in order to cultivate a particular impression of himself.
Are often deliberate. Here he's at the funeral of a cabinet colleague. He's laughing and joking, unaware that he's being filmed. Suddenly, he spots the television camera. He immediately stops laughing, lowers his head, adopts a mournful expression, and appears to wipe away his tears. Here, Clinton knows exactly what he's doing. But when it comes to deliberate tells, Clinton's pièce de résistance is his lip bite. He does this when he wants us to think that he's been overcome with emotion. The lip bite pretends to be an unconscious means of self-restraint, a way of controlling strong emotions. But its real purpose is to draw attention to his feelings. Like the time he asked the American people for forgiveness for his misdemeanors with Monica Lewinsky. On this occasion, he deploys the lip bite no fewer than 15 times in just over 2 minutes.
I don't think there is a fancy way to say that I have sinned. I have asked all for their forgiveness, that I have done wrong.
Because the lip bite is so discreet, people who see it don't necessarily notice it. This doesn't mean that they aren't affected by it. They are. They just don't know it.
The only difference between a sinner and a saint is that one's found forgiveness and the other one ain't. Amen.
Now, touch, as we all know, is often a sign of affection, a way of embracing other people, connecting with them. But that's not his only purpose. There are occasions on which people use touch as a power signal, or what psychologists call a status reminder. Now, I don't know whether you've been watching Obama, but he cannot resist the opportunity to touch other politicians and visiting heads of state. Here, for example, we see him patting Benjamin Netanyahu, the Premier of Israel. This is not because he wants to connect with him, it's because he wants to remind him that he is the man in charge. Now, when people, for example, you're the host and you allow your guest through the door first, that practice is normally considered to be a gesture of politeness. But it also provides you, as the host, with an opportunity to pat the other person, your guest, as they go through the door. Or, if there's an exchange of pats, to ensure that you, at the very least, have the last pat. In other words, so that you can remind them that you are in charge. Now, that's all very fine. That is the prerogative of the host. But what happens when neither party is the host?
When neither party is host, these tussles can really heat up. That's exactly what happened when the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, and the then Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, were guests of President Clinton. Arafat and Barak represented the opposing sides in the age-old conflict between their peoples. Watch what happens when they try to decide who's going through the door first. At the time, the media regarded this incident as a piece of good-humoured horseplay about who was the more polite, but the media hadn't read the tells. They failed to recognize that Barak and Arafat were engaged in a battle of arms control. Deep down, neither wanted the other to look powerful. They both wanted control.
Now, bringing the topic closer to home, you can often tell by looking at the body language whether or not a marriage or a long-term relationship is going to last. Specifically, I'm thinking of two things. One, the degree to which two individuals are attentive to each other, and secondly, the extent to which they display negative emotions in relation to each other. What I'm going to show you now is a clip of video of Charles and Diana's wedding, and I want you to watch out for the way in which Charles, in particular, does not pay attention to his bride.
Watch how the two of them use their eyes. While the Archbishop is reading out the groom's vows, Diana is gazing at Charles, but Charles is watching the Archbishop. When the Archbishop reads out the bride's vows, Charles exchanges a fond, reassuring glance with Diana. That's a good sign, but from this point on, his eyes remain elsewhere. Down at the ground, up at the heavens, everywhere except at his chosen bride.
Now, there's a little-known gesture of discomfort called the eye wipe, which also features in this wedding. When people are feeling sad, distraught, regretful, they often wipe away an imaginary tear. They don't know that they're doing it, but it's a pretty sure sign that something serious is bothering them.
Prince Charles uses this gesture right in the middle of his wedding.
Unadvisedly, lightly or wantonly, but reverently, discreetly, soberly, and in the fear of God.
What's worrying him? Is he lamenting his lost youth? Or is there something else on his mind? Nearly 1 billion people watched this wedding on television. No one spotted Charles wiping his eye, and nor did I at the time. But this tiny tell spoke volumes about his discomfort.
Now, in our attempts to understand each other, we're all too ready to focus our attention on what people say and on their large movements. But as we've seen, rather briefly, it's often those tiny little gestures, actions that we are too ready to overlook or ignore, that provide the essential clues to what people are thinking and feeling. I believe that in our daily lives, in our dealings with other people, we need to be much more like the poker player. We need, first of all, to focus our attention on our own behavior, that is, those cues that we are inadvertently giving off, sometimes without even realizing it. Secondly, we need to be attentive to those actions, those tells that other people use in an attempt to control and manipulate us. Think of Clinton. And finally, we also need to be thinking about those bits of what psychologists call leakage. That is, those unintentional actions that people produce that provide clues to what they're thinking, feeling, and in some cases are likely to do next. Thank you.